Okay, I think we're ready to go. So, welcome. Good afternoon. I know that this is the last session of the last day of a conference in Las Vegas. So I applaud anyone who stays awake through this whole thing. Right? So when I first started thinking about what I was going to talk to everybody about today, a lot of the talks that I've seen over the past year or so about natural user interface, about touch, about gesture, have looked at it from sometimes a research perspective, sometimes just a very high-level strategic perspective. And what I wanted to do is look at it from the perspective of someone who works in the field and mostly from a practitioner's point of view. And that's why I call this sort of the untold stories, some of the things you haven't heard. I'm sure you have heard some of them, but hopefully not all of them. So again, like I said, all the talks that I've seen to date, I think can be summed up pretty easily. Right? So this is pretty much what I've heard from most people who talk about touch right now. Is anyone here from Stimulant, actually? No? So Stimulant is one of our partners at Surface, and I stole this image from one of the talks they used, because the last conference I talked about, the guy went before me and stole my whole talk. So I felt it was okay to steal one of their images. So I'll start out with making sort of three bold statements. The first is that touch is not good for everything. Right? It's not an end-all solution. The second is that touch computing is an evolution. It's not a revolution. It's an additional element for users to interact with their content. And the last thing is there are certain things that touch is really good at. Certain things that it's not, but certain things that it is. And we have now had new technology that can enable these touch systems and can enhance these activities. And so these are the three things that I'll really be covering today. Before I go further, I'll introduce myself. So first and foremost, I'm a designer. I work on the Microsoft Surface team. You may have seen me sitting at the booth in the bookstore, third place, whatever that area is called a lot, demoing a lot of the applications. I'm a big fan of music. And the reason for this is I always look for bands that approach music in a different way. And why that helps me is because when I go back to design teams, that always makes me think about how I interact with different team members of designers, of developers, of testers, and just how to approach things a little bit different. I'm also a huge fan of professional wrestling. I know most people in my position would never admit that, and most people my age would never admit that. But I'm a huge fan because in a lot of ways I feel professional wrestling mirrors what I do in an odd sense, and that designers are inherently storytellers in a lot of ways, and so are professional wrestlers. The last conference I spoke at in Mexico, I was actually lucky enough to meet that nice masked man there who was another speaker at the conference. So I don't know what's wrong with US conferences, why we don't have professional lucha libre wrestlers speaking, but I would tell organizers to get those people on the phone. And the last thing is I'm a fan of anime, novels, movies, anything that pushes a cyberpunk theme. So Microsoft Surface, you guys have probably seen this. You guys probably played with it. If you haven't, I'll mention it very briefly so at least everyone's on a level playing field. You guys can read that. I won't read it for you. But basically, it's a large, horizontal, multi-touch computer. Right? And so through the use of gesture and the use of real-world objects, it allows you to interact with digital content in new and unique ways. I'm a little bit tentative about playing this next video because I think everyone's probably seen it about 100 times. But if you haven't, I do want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and I'll only play about 60 seconds of it. And I hope clicking this button will make this work, but there we go.
Microsoft Surface represents a new bridge into the digital world. One that lets you shuffle the day's photos like an editor. And then send them through the mail. Surface is a new concierge in the lobby.
So I'll pause it there because how many people have seen that video before? Yeah, like most people here. So the rest of it just goes on to explain more about what Surface is. And for anyone who's wondering, we have seen the big ass table video. I used to use it in presentations. I don't use it here. But for those of you who haven't seen it, it's basically a video that a few people made making fun of Surface. So, for example, why use Surface to look up a map when you can use a mobile phone to do that? So Surface went out about 9 months ago or so. And we've gone out initially to a very limited number of partners. These are a few of them. AT&T, we use them in their retail stores, or I should say they use them in their retail stores to enhance the buying activity. So instead of finding a sales associate, you can simply pick up one of their phones, put it down on Surface, and it will tell you more information about that phone. Harrah's Casinos, they own the Rio down the street. They have several of these in their iBar. And they've used these to enhance a lot of the social activities that happen in bars. So you can go there, you can order drinks on them. They have actually a very interesting application that I can only speak very high level about, so I don't have HR coming after me when I get back to work. But it's an application called Flirt, where they take Surface and they tie into the security cameras at the iBar, and you can see other people using other Surfaces, and then you can send them messages. So it's a great way to hide behind technology as an icebreaker. Sheraton puts Surface in their hotel lobbies for a few of their hotels. And in the same way that the Rio uses them, Sheraton uses them to enhance these social activities that happen in an otherwise sort of less technological area, like a hotel lobby. MSNBC used Surface for their election coverage in the last year. For Microsoft Surface, my job, I handle work around vision for it, I handle work around strategy, and as my title would indicate, I also handle design work. I'm in a unique spot working for Surface. So not only do I get to handle this horizontal form factor, massive multi-touch, multi-user aspects, but recently I've also gotten to stretch across the company a little bit, and I've worked with Windows a lot on looking at how we could bring Surface technology and this type of different touch experience to Windows. So now looking at personal computers, much different form factors and different pieces of technology. And these are several things that you'll see pop up again as I talk through all these various untold things. I would be upset if I didn't say that there's a large team behind me that is allowing me to be here right now that I'm representing. So I thank that team and I applaud them for all the hard work that they've allowed. Again, coming back to these 3 points, you'll see the slide several times. The things that I'm going to reinforce, that touch is not good for everything, touch is an evolution, and that it's really great for specific activities and aspects. I do want to introduce a bit of the vocabulary that I use. So touch, the act of directly touching your digital content, gesture, hand motions in order to take an action on that content, and then manipulation, which is alteration or free-form movement of digital content. I tend to use these words a little bit interchangeably. I know I probably shouldn't, but so when you guys hear me say these different words, that's generally what I'm meaning. And you take all of these and you put them together, and that's the baseline for natural user interface. At Surface, we think about a natural user interface as a little bit more than simply touch and gesture, and you'll see that in a little bit. So in order to support those 3 points, I've broken my talk up into 3 sections. You'll also see the number 3 pop up a lot. The first is around the history and ecology of input, a very brief one because it's about 10 minutes. The second part is looking at the Surface design principles as a case study. And the third is looking at all the challenges once you get into designing for touch systems, and that may be the most interesting part. So let's start with the history and ecology. The question that I came when I asked the Surface is, why evolve? Why change what we have? Why do something different? Right? We have personal computers, we have laptops. Why did we need to change to a horizontal form factor? And a very large computer and a computer for social activities. In order to understand that, I'm going to take a brief journey through the past. I'm not going to go all the way back to punch cards, but I am going to go back to command line interfaces. How many people were in the talk for designing for non-designers a little while ago? Okay, so you just saw this. I apologize. Luckily, there's only like 4 of you. So you just saw some of this. So command line interface. For those of you who remember it, it was a lovely black screen with oftentimes green or white ugly text on it. It was a bit like a black art or black magic if you didn't know it. You had to live in a command line interface 8 hours a day to really understand it, use it well, use it efficiently. On the positive side, if you did know it really well, you can use it really efficiently. There's a nice developer who's standing in the back of the room back there, Michael, who I walk into his office all the time, and he still has command line interface up on his screen because it's just simply that efficient when you know what you're doing. The problem is you can't walk up to it and use it, right? So in the 80s, we had the graphic user interface, and we had the mouse in order to use it. So you had the keyboard for the graphic or for the command line. You had a mouse for a graphic user interface. And the graphic user interface really allowed this explosion or phenomenon of the personal computer, right? It became much easier for people to walk up to it and use it because now it made use of visuals, spatial relationships, metaphors, all these great things that, oh, I have a mailbox here. That must be where I get communications. And so it became easier for people to understand it. So now we have a natural user interface. And a natural user interface, as I mentioned, sort of the baseline is about touch, gesture, and manipulation of objects. And so because we had this new type of input, we said there needs to be a new computer to go with it that really takes advantage of what this new type of input can do. So once again, you have these big sort of inflection points in computing history, command line interface, graphic user interface, and now natural user interface, and you have the tools that go with them. And so we evolved because we felt that this new type of input was worthy enough to develop a new system around it. I mentioned a little while ago that we thought about natural user interface at Surface as a little bit more than touch and gesture. So that is the first part. The other things that we tend to think about is massive multi-touch. So most systems, if any of you have used touch PCs, are probably around 2 points of contact. Surface optimizes for up to 52 points of contact and can go higher than that if pushed. I wouldn't recommend it, but realistically, you probably never need 52 points of contact. To go along with that, it's multi-user, right? So something inherent in touch is that it can be great with a multi-user environment, that lots of people can gather around it and use it all at the same time. And the last part is object recognition. If anyone ever thought to themselves, why is that damn table so big? It's because inside of it we have 5 cameras and a projector that read what people do on the surface of the screen and then project an image up. Because we're vision-based and we have cameras watching the top, we can take an object, we can put it down on the surface, and the surface can read that object and then present you with more information about it. What I don't want to have happen with natural user interface is this, right? Most people now no longer use the term Web 2.0, but about a year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this was the big thing. I had a manager come to me and say that a project I was working on that was web-driven, they wanted it more Web 2.0. It was very clear no one knew what the hell that meant except for a few people. But the problem was, because no one knew what it meant and used it all the time, it became a trendy word. It became a novelty. And I don't want the same thing to happen to natural user interface. So that's why when I give talks like this, I dig down into some of the practical parts of this and not simply throw it out and say, great, we're touch, it's natural, hooray. So it shouldn't be a novelty. One of the first things to do is stop using that damn image, right? Really, there are a lot of things that can be cool with Tom Cruise. Natural user interface isn't one of them. So to understand that a little bit better, this slide should help illustrate the point that there are many different inputs. This isn't an exhaustive slide. I know voice isn't on it. But the idea is that it gives a list of different inputs, and it gives just a few things they're good and bad for. And so once you start to understand that there's an ecosystem of inputs out there, then you start to say, well, why would I use touch, right? What is touch really good for? And once you start to think about what touch is good for, this is where you can start to take advantage of natural user interfaces more so. I had someone the other day ask me why we haven't put Office on Surface yet. And there are various reasons for it, but one of the big things is that Office in its current form isn't really good for touch, right? It's not made for that. It's made for a mouse system. So once you understand what touch can bring to the table, that helps you design and develop what you need. Even within touch, there's an ecosystem of different types of natural user interface, of touch. So again, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a partial ecosystem. So there's multi-point. A system can accept 2 points or more points of contact. There's multi-touch. And I switch over to touch there because a multi-touch system can infer something based on the way that you touch. So if I've touched this way versus this way versus this way, right, it can tell me how I've touched it, and then it can orient the system to respond to that touch. And then the last thing, again, we think about natural user interface as more than that, and also having the combination of things like digital and physical relationships. I've heard a few people mention, well, not just a few people, I've heard IXDA, the Interaction Design Association, mention that tap is the new click. And this is one of those things that, to me, just kills me because it feels like we're going to go down the novelty path here. Because to say tap is the new click completely not only ignores what touch and tap is great for and gesture, but it completely ignores anything about the mouse and what that is good for. So you really have to consider the context of use when you're designing any system, basically, especially a natural user interface, and then realize that touch just isn't a solution for a problem. And once you start to interpret that, then you can figure out, okay, what can we really build that looks great and works great? So we come back to these 3 points. That was the first section, that brief overview of input, ecology, and history. And I hope I pointed out there are a few things that, touch is not good for everything. There's a whole input system out there for you to use. That touch is an evolution, and that was the why evolve part. And being great for specific aspects, that's what we're about to get into. So I'm going to use the surface design principles as a case study in a way. I work there, so it's very easy for me to do that. And share with you why this is more of an evolution. When Surface started, and when I got there a while ago, our goal was to create an inflection point. Right? We hypothesized at the start of almost every successful technological innovation is marked by an inflection point, right? This moment of dramatic change. And we also said to ourselves, companies spend about 90% of their energy trying to imitate. Unfortunately, I forgot the source on this, but realistically, all you have to do is think about any innovative product and then how many copies there are of that innovative product. And that's why on Surface, we look at doing something very different. That's why we're social. That's why we're vision-based, right? We don't want to just go down the path that everyone else is taking. We want to do something very, very different. So there are 5 design principles that we adhere to. And they're based on history, and we use that history to develop the future. You guys remember this. We just saw this a few minutes ago. So for each one of these, we go back to the first point, the starting point, the command line interface, and say, what was important there? And then if we use that to start, what's important in a natural user interface? So for example, in a command line interface, you have recall. So I have to remember and at any point recall in my own head the commands that I need to use to get the system to execute something. For a graphic user interface, I have recognition. Right? I don't have to remember everything because it is visual, it is spatial, and it uses metaphors. So now I can remember some of those ideas, and that makes it easier for me to walk up to and use. With a natural user interface, we believe it should be a little bit more intuitive to use. And I know that word's thrown around a lot, but it was particularly important for us because where surfaces were placed were things that people only interacted with them for about 2 minutes. And many people who had interacted with them had never interacted with touch computers before. And if we had people leave from that 2-minute session bewildered or confused, right, that's the worst possible spot you can have people leave. And so when you only have 2 minutes to do something, you have to make it a little bit intuitive and a little bit simple to use. And it's a pretty tough challenge. Command line interface is directed. Right? You have to tell it exactly what to do at any point. A graphic user interface is more exploratory. Because you have, again, this spatial, visual imagery, you can walk up to it and explore it and find things. A natural user interface should be contextual. So when you're interacting with content, it should present you with the correct tools versus burdening the user on figuring out what to do. Command line interface has a high amount of paths and commands. So when I'm at one point in a command line interface, I can pretty much get to any other point by just recalling and remembering and telling the system exactly what to do. With the graphic user interface, we split that. We said, there are about 5 ways to do anything. So every task, you can pick your way to do it, right? With a natural user interface, we said we're going to concentrate on the fast few. Just those few things, those 1 or 2 ways to complete a task. And one of the ways we think about this and sort of look at it is if you're, let's say if you're a space planner or working with an architect firm, and you're building a college campus. And you put two buildings right next to each other. Right? And I've seen this mistake done many times. A lot of people put the sidewalks in right away. Right? And then students end up trampling all over the grass anyway. And so what we think about for getting to the fast few is if you put those two buildings next to each other before you put the sidewalks in, watch where the students walk. It will wear the paths naturally, and then you can pick that up. And it becomes much easier to say, oh, this is exactly where we should lay the sidewalk in order for our grass not to get trampled. Where I went to college, they actually ended up putting in like an additional 2 sidewalks. I think we had 4 sidewalks between buildings because they didn't think about that. This is stupid. Yeah, you remember this, the big diagonal sidewalk right in the middle of, God. So command line interface is disconnected, right? You're just sort of typing on a keyboard. You're telling the computer what to do. A graphic user interface is indirect. I have a mouse which sort of acts as a little bit of an avatar for my hand that runs around the screen. So I move my hand down here, mouse moves up here. That's wonderful. And then in a natural user interface, it should be unmediated. And this is a fancy way of saying direct, basically, right? It should all be about direct input with your content. The last one is a command line interface is static. It doesn't really move unless you count moving up for every line you type. A graphic user interface is responsive. You tell it what to do, it responds to you. And a natural user interface, we said, should be evocative. So it should help suggest and tell you what to do based on what's needed. Someone just finished. So you take these 5 points, and you get the 5 principles that we have: performance aesthetics, direct manipulation, scaffolding, contextual environments, and the super real. And the super real one is, I won't dive further into those except for the super real one, which is my favorite one, because it basically allows you to break all laws of nature, which is really cool. Right? So I can take, on a Surface computer, I can take one of these guys. Yeah, just like I can in real life, I can move it around, look, I can rotate it, that's great. But then I can take it and I can scale it. Right? I can put 2 fingers on it and make it larger. I can't do that no matter how hard I try to this piece of paper. And that's one of the things I love when you can actually directly interact with your digital content. You can make it better than what exists in the real world. So we have those 5 principles, and there are 3 super principles, or pillars, or tenets, or whatever you want to call them. And these are the things that we believe make Surface really unique amongst natural user interfaces. The first one is social, so multiple simultaneous users. So you can see on the right there, you have the beautiful marketing shot of the couple using a Surface in their home. We of course, see much of this. And then on the other side, you see a picture that I took at a conference a little while ago, at the Interaction Design Conference up in Vancouver last month. And the point that I wanted to get across with this is when I came to Surface, I was actually fairly skeptical of the social aspects. I by nature, am very skeptical and take a long time to really study what's going on with products in order to make a better product. And so when I came to Surface and they said, well, it's a social computer, I sort of furrowed my brow and said, really? And I'd seen a lot of the marketing shots. But what's great is in the last year that I've seen Surface out in environments where people can use it, it is truly a computer that multiple people gather around and multiple people touch. So in this case, of the shot that you see with everyone touching Surface, what the people at that conference did was on the back of badges, they put little barcodes that Surface could read. So people could bring up their badge, put it down on a Surface, and then connect with other people through email. Right? So they took something that was normally a standard badge and now made it something that you could put it into a physical or a digital world. So it was a great combination of physical and digital reality. And then as well as people really got a kick out of just putting it down, connecting with other people, playing around with photos or Twitter feeds. And it made me realize that this is something that has a lot of merit to it, the social aspect. The second thing is that digital and physical combined. So again, with our vision system, it's one of the key things that we have at Surface, that you can take objects from the real world, put them down, and now all of a sudden, digitally they are enhanced. The last part is spatial. So this gets to the idea of kinesthetics, as well as what we call portals. And so you have your, because of direct input and because of the way that you can reach out and touch things, it can make better use of your spatial memory, as well as we sort of look at Surface almost as reaching through to this extra digital world. So you take those 3 things and you take those 5 things, and our goal with all of that was really this one phrase, was that to overcome homeostasis, which is basically For the last 20 years or so in computing, we've done more or less the same thing. There are personal computers, there are desktop systems, and they've changed, they've gotten better, but for the most part, they're still personal computers and they're still desktop. And we said for this, we didn't want to go down that route. We wanted to do something different, and we wanted to change the way people thought about technology. So we wanted to make it social, and we wanted to make it massive multi-touch. We wanted to use vision and all those things to get over the sort of lull that we've been in. So coming back to these 3 points, so touch is not good for everything. Didn't really hit on that one too much this time. Touch is an evolution. That was the big one, and touch is great for specific aspects. So those principles that I outlined, that's what we really feel touch is great for. So the last part, and possibly one of the more interesting, the touch challenges. It's my favorite part because I get to say, let's become practitioners. And this is one of the truest things that I've seen people miss when they talk about touch at conferences, because they hit up really big touch walls, IP for individual companies. But what I can talk about, because I am in this unique spot of working for Surface and Windows, is touch on social computers and touch on personal computers and what that means. So let's take the first challenge of form factor and technology. Right? These are a few different systems that are touch-enabled. The first two, you have the Dell XT, which laptop computer goes into slate mode. The third one there is an HP Touch Smart. The fourth one is, of course, Surface. And the last one is a Wacom tablet. I have that up there for a very specific reason, which I'll mention in a second. So one of the problems when you get to form factor, whenever you design applications, and we found this when we were looking at how we bring Surface technology to Windows. Whenever you design applications, one of the best practices is to put your toolbars at the top of your windows, right? Like every application has their tools across the top of the window. Now, when we were looking at the Dells over there, those laptops, what we found out is now that you have this different type of input, we put our toolbars across the top, just like anybody else would, and we started touching it. And what happens, and anyone who's out there that has a laptop can do this, can touch the top of their screen, is it wobbles, right? It's not stable whatsoever. And especially on the Dells, because they have a pivot hinge, they're especially unstable, and they wobble all over the place. Not to mention we're probably causing irreversible damage to the pivot hinge by continually hitting the top of the screen and causing it to move. But what we did is we took all our controls and we put them at the bottom of the screen, where it was a much more stable environment. So just one of those examples of how now you have this different type of input, and now you have to think about how you're designing your applications a little bit different. When you go into the second picture, when you go into slate mode, right, you have a flat computer. A lot of people will hold their computers in one hand and use the other hand to touch it. So now if you're designing applications for a Windows 7 ecosystem, you've run into this problem of, have I done any gestures or have I created any interactions with touch that require two hands? Because if I hold it with one hand, I only have one hand to work with at this point. Right, so it can get fairly difficult. With the HP Touch Smart, it's a vertical system. So now you have to think about, how am I going to use this vertical system? Am I pivoting my elbow on the table? Again, if the controls are at the top of the screen, now I have to lift my arm up, and my shoulder gets strained after about 60 seconds of use. With Surface, I've talked a lot about that. So obviously now it's a horizontal form factor with a great variety of touch. And the last one, the Wacom, I said there was a very specific example of why I had that up here. And that's because Wacom did something really nice with this tablet, is they made it angled, similar to a drafting table. And I've seen many people use this, and it always seems to be very comfortable and very natural. And when I've thought about great natural user interfaces, everyone goes off about touch. And to me, Wacom did something here that was really important, where they really looked at how people worked with pen, paper, and they created a system around that. So that's why I have that up there, just to bring up that one point that they did something that was really natural. So that's the first round of difficulty. Now we move into the second. We have technology. The first two Dells are capacitive. That means that you have to use basically the fleshy tip of your finger in order to touch it. It's a charge that's caused by your body. If any of you have iPhones, which I'm sure like half the room does, those are capacitive. The HP Touch Smarts are infrared based, so they have little cameras that basically shower the screen with a blanket of infrared. And it's a few millimeters above the screen, so you don't actually have to touch the screen in order to make a contact point. The problem with this is that you have many people who touch the screen like this, who use their index finger and make that little curl with their knuckle. So now when they touch the screen, they could have that knuckle or that thumb actually break that blanket of infrared, causing an accidental contact point. And for any of you that have used the HP Touch Smarts, or that have even used Surface, sometimes you'll be doing something and your piece of content will shoot off to the side somewhere, right? And that's what happens is when you get these accidental ghost contacts, your content can fly all over the place and get messed up. With Surface, you have challenges that when you're on a horizontal device, and I'm sure anyone who's gone and used Surface has run across this, you have your elbows or your forearms or your clothes that can make accidental hits as well. So that's the second layer of complexity that as you go through all these different hardware and technology ecosystems that you run into. The third is the amount of inputs they can receive. So the Dells, and I'm using the Dell and HP as examples. There's many different types of technology out there, and I'm sure there'll be many more to come. I just pulled these out as an example to show you guys. The Dells use anywhere from 2 to 10 points of touch based on the drivers. I have heard the term 10 points. I've never actually seen that work. I've only seen 4 points work. So the technology in the HP Touch Smarts, infrared, can only accept 2 points of touch. Surface can do 52. The Wacom, of course, 1. But now, if you're designing an application across an ecosystem of hardware, how do you think about what you have to do if some systems can only support 2 touches and some systems can support 10? Do you fall back to the lowest common denominator of now everything can only do 10? Or do you say, OK, on lower-end systems, we're going to build everything so that it can work with 2, but on higher-end systems, we're going to do something like a shortcuts or something else special that can allow you to use richer gestures. So another challenge that you run into is patterns, right? And I've heard this word come up more and more about graphic user interfaces, patterns, pattern libraries, all this stuff that pops up. And this is a very simple example that shows where patterns in natural user interface break down and where they have problems. So for example, in Firefox, when you swipe left, it brings your history back to you. So what that is an indirect model of manipulation. So I have my hand here, I have my content here. I swipe left, it pulls my content basically right. It's like a scroll bar. Then you move to the iPhone, and you swipe left, and it takes you forward. So you have this very, very basic pattern. Like, people were like, oh, who could really mess up a swipe, right? But there now are conflicting things for 2 products that have fairly high penetration. I have a strong belief that this will work itself out in the next few years, but it's something to think about when you start designing for touch. What are the patterns that you're using, and are you creating new patterns that are going to be adopted? Orientation, I touched on this a little bit, so I'll breeze through this. But you have horizontal, you have vertical. I didn't include angled on here. I haven't really seen many angled touchscreens yet. But of course, horizontal, you're working with gravity, so it's a little easier to touch. You do have the problems of resting your forearms or elbows there, so you could get accidental contacts. With a vertical system, you now have to hold your arms out, right? I challenge anyone who thinks vertical systems are what people are going to be working on for 8 hours a day to hold your arms out like this for more than about 60 seconds, and it sucks. It is not easy whatsoever. And when you hold your arms out as well, you're fighting gravity, so you have a little bit less accurate hit area. So playing off the issue of holding your arms out for a long time, there is a cardio effect that comes with touch. Right? So for anyone who's been sitting and using Surface for 30 minutes, they start to realize, like, OK, I'm getting a little tired now. Or, oh, I'm bending over. Oh, I'm holding my shoulders up. Right? So it does take a toll that you're no longer just moving your wrist a little bit, but you're moving a lot of parts of your body. So paradigms. To button or not to button. I'll tell you a short story. When I first came to Surface, I was working on an application that basically dealt with mapping. It's out there. It's called Concierge. It's out on Surface. You can go check it out. And what happened is when we started working with this, it was all gesture. Right? There was no buttons. There was no remnants of a GUI paradigm, GUI interaction. And when we put this into usability and user testing, it went really well, right? It came back. It was, thumbs up, wonderful. But one of the requests was that people wanted to rotate the map with 1 finger, right? Rotating the map now requires 2 fingers because 1 finger pans. And we said, great, that's not hard. We'll take the compass and put a small control on it so that you can rotate based on the compass. Like, no problem, solves it. So we did that. We put it back into usability testing probably about 2 weeks later, and people bombed. And we were sitting there scratching our heads trying to figure out. We didn't change anything else, and we put in a feature that people were like, oh, I'd love to see this. So why did it bomb this time? And what we found out was that when people immediately saw this control, they looked for other controls to zoom in and zoom out. They looked for other controls to pan, right? Just like when you go to Google Maps or Live Maps or any other mapping situation, you have a bunch of GUI controls that can control that map for you. And so when people saw one control, they looked for other ones, and they totally forgot that they could manipulate it with their hands. And so we had to take that control out, and it worked great again. But it was an example of why mixing paradigms can put people in an incorrect mindset and cause them to look for other things. Now, the other side of this is we've been working on new applications, and it's actually very similar to the concierge application, Maps again, and we have put a few buttons in. And this was for, again, testing out technology on Windows 7, and those buttons didn't fail, and those buttons actually helped people. So I don't have a good answer for when to use buttons or when not to use buttons. I don't have a best practice. I don't have a blanket statement. I've just found that we've been very careful about when and how we mix paradigms and very judicious about it. Getting people to touch is always a challenge, right? For the last 20 years, you touch someone's screen, you get smacked in the back of the head and told to go get a Kleenex to wipe it off. But now we have to encourage people to touch the screen, something that they've been ridiculed and yelled at for 20 years. We have to tell them, not only is it okay, but in some cases you have to do that in order to use the application. So there are two basic ways of doing this. One is sort of exploration. For those of you who have seen Surface, we do this with our water application. And this is a way that just interests people to touch the screen and says, it's okay to touch, right? This is something that you can do. This is a new type of input that you can now use. The other way is that you explicitly instruct them. You tell them what to do. So the iPhone does this right at the bottom there to say slide to unlock. And so it just depends what you're doing and what type of experience you're utilizing, whether you can use something that's a little more explorative or something that you have to instruct people. Would probably also depend on the task. Visualizing touch has been actually a fairly big challenge for us and something that we've been looking at at Surface for about the last 6 months. This was spearheaded by one of our design researchers, Daniel Wigder, from an interesting story that he had on Virgin Airlines. How many of you have flown Virgin in the US? Okay, so not many. So Virgin has a touch systems in the back of each headrest, right? So you can watch TV on them. So what happened is Daniel, this nice researcher, was sitting in his seat, and behind him was a kid about 7 or 8 years old who really wanted to interact with their system, and about once or twice, I guess every few minutes, would just hit on it. And when a system doesn't work, and you think it's a touch system, your natural reaction is to hit it harder, right? So Daniel's getting this about every few minutes and getting pretty ticked off. But the insight that came out of this was that the child didn't realize if the computer was broken, right? Maybe the flight attendants hadn't turned it on. Maybe he was doing something wrong. Maybe he wasn't hitting it hard enough. And what happened is you actually had to hit it in a certain area or something like that. But what he realized is that there was no way to know if you were right or if you were wrong. On a graphic user interface with a mouse, for better or for worse, you have that haptic feedback that you get when you press that, right? You have that auditory click when you press it. You have the mouse moving around in front of you. You know the system heard you. You know it's not frozen. But you don't know that on touch screens. So what we've been working on internally are ways to visualize when you touch so that people actually understand when the system heard them. I would go further into that, but I unfortunately can't. So. But the reason I bring that up is because I hadn't seen anyone ever discuss that, and it had come out from this great observation of a child hitting on the back of this guy's headrest for a while. So those are some of the challenges that we've run into when looking across Surface, when looking across Windows, all these different hardware, software, technology issues. So where do we go from here? What's sort of the future, and how do we think about that? So this is a quote that I love from Ghost in the Shell. and that your effort to remain what you are is what limits you. And this ties back into the overcoming homeostasis comment, was that we've embraced the desktop. We've embraced the personal computer. But what that's done is limited us and locked us in to that type of technology. And so for Surface, and I encourage everybody else to do this, because we're putting Surface out there, but the more people that do it and the more people that can do something different is always better, and is always better for people and their use of technology. And so for us, we said we're not going to let anything limit us. We're going to look at something totally different. So for me, debating the future, despite I enjoy doing it, it's sort of useless, and creating the future is much, much more interesting. So bringing back to these 3 points I started with: touch, not necessarily good for everything. Touch is an evolution, and that it's really good for specific aspects. And I hope for these 3 points I've supported those well enough. I hope for these 3 points you see that I'm not up here as a person working for Surface evangelizing how great touch is, but I'm trying to come at it from a point of view that touch is great, but there are certain drawbacks to it, and you shouldn't run around saying that in 3 years, in 2 years, everything will be touch, right? It completely ignores everything else that's out there right now. So there are a few last random things I'll mention before I wrap up. I've had a lot of people come with me in the Surface booth in the last few days and talking about, how much our Surface is, how can I buy one, what do I do? And so one of the things that we're going to do when we go out and speak at conferences like this, for anyone who's interested in just learning more about Surface, if you come to me afterwards, give me a business card, give me a name, and we'll get you the SDK. We'll just hand it over to you for free, and you can just play around with it on your computer. There's an emulator that you can run on your computer that can treat it like Surface. So for anyone who's interested, can treat it as long as you do multiple inputs. It won't make your computer touch. But for anyone who's interested, please come see me afterwards. The second thing is that for those of you who are interested, you can go to surface.com and actually see videos and more instruction to help you. And the last thing, a few people have gotten this information from me, but if you do want to purchase a Surface, you can email that email address, or again, you can come talk to me. So in closing, I always like to leave my talks with a little bit of inspiration, something a little bit fun. And this is a video that was done by an internal team at Microsoft called Office Labs. And this is a look at technology in 2019. Some of you have probably seen this. It's been around Gizmodo. But I love to end with it because it has a lot of different Surface-style computing in it. I think it's a great video to sort of usher this talk out. Las Vegas. Thank you. I believe I have a few minutes for question looking at this. Ran through that in about 45 minutes. So if you have any questions, there's a microphone. Please feel free to ask. Anybody? Hand up? Nothing? Yes. I don't think, I mean, internally we've explored a lot of different things. A lot of what we do now is we just think about how to get people used to touching things, interested in touching things, a lot of that kind of work. So internally, a lot of the talks that have been happening, especially with Microsoft, is so much stuff has to be about productivity. And for Surface, we said we just wanted to overcome that by getting people to accept that having fun could be okay. So you saw in some of that video, there were opportunities for collaborative decision-making and that kind of information, but we haven't explored applications around that too much in Surface yet. Yep.
Word had it that BlackBerry was going to go with haptic size, some kind of piezoelectric response.
Was it the Storm? Is that what you're thinking?
I think so, but that's motor-driven now.
Mm-hmm.
But this was actually a film on the screen generating a click, a touch click in response. Again, the rumor is that at some point late in the development cycle, they ran into a problem. Just wondering, it sounds like you hadn't heard that. Wondering what the problem was.
I haven't heard that. There are a few systems that I haven't worked with yet. Palm? Okay. Yeah, so I haven't, there are a few systems I haven't worked with. There are a few like overlays that you can buy and put on computers or TVs or something like that. So that's one of them, just technologies that I haven't been aware of or I haven't worked with yet. So I've been able to cover a lot, but yeah, not everything.
Just as a follow-up to that, are you guys doing anything in the way that you talk about, in the way of just manipulating the feel of the surface based on, different paper versus slick surfaces, et cetera, dynamic surface?
I think your initial comment of things I can't talk about, the answer would fall into into that, unfortunately.
Also, at the iBar, they have a kind of an overlay on top of their units there. It's almost like a film. It's probably more to prevent drinks from
Yeah.
out of it, but it's definitely a different feel of the mat.
Yeah.
It works still.
Yeah. So the comment was just around sort of the feel of it, and what I mentioned I couldn't say anything about was, sorry for not repeating the questions. What I mentioned I couldn't say anything about was the idea: does the surface of the table change or have any dynamic properties? Are we thinking of anything about that? So to that question of at the iBar at the Rio, there's a bit of a film over it. I believe that is for drink spillage, although Surface was developed. One of the reasons that it is expensive is because it is developed to be a very sturdy product. So you should be able to throw drinks on that, throw water on it. With the newer hardware units, you can stand on them, right? I mean, so people sort of treat them very daintily, but there are many times where I'll just sort of walk into a room and sit on one if I have to, right? If there's no chair available. So they're pretty sturdy pieces of hardware. The interesting follow-up to that is just when you talked about the different feeling of the surface is the HP Touch Smarts have a very glossy screen to them, which creates a lot of drag when you move your finger around. So one of the things on Surface, why it sort of feels that way and it's a little more matte, is because it's much easier to drag your finger around versus this high gloss surface, which sort of pulls on your finger. iPhone, at the same way, has a little bit of that, but you're not doing these broad sweeps on iPhone, so it's more acceptable. So, yeah. So the question was, what's the likelihood that gestures can be customized by users for different applications? So if you get the software development kit, there are a few recognized gestures. I believe, right? We do, yeah. So we do have recognized gestures in there. If you want to make custom gestures, I believe you. I mean, I'm looking to our developer back here. I believe you can do that, but it will take the work required that you have to input that and make that a recognized gesture. But when we give you even the basic gestures, you can assign them to whatever you want, right? We give you the ability that the system input accepts this type of gesture, but you can assign it to this or that. I mean, you could make swipe rotate the map if you wanted to, but not sure why you would want to. So, yeah. Is there? So the question was, is there a virtual Earth control for the Surface? I know Concierge, the application that's out there right now that uses Virtual Earth, has it on there, but do you know? Yes.
But it's not compatible with the one running with Concierge.
Okay, so I'm being told there is one, but it's not compatible with the Concierge one. I can tell you from working on Concierge that there are several problems with working with Virtual Earth and just dealing with the issue of the technology of Virtual Earth and the technology of touch, and when you get into that. But obviously, we found ways to make it work. So. So we always think about what we want to do next with Surface. So yes, there has been a lot of conversation. So the question was, has there been thoughts of Surface in the home? There's been a lot of thought around it, obviously, and a lot of people have asked us, when are we going to be able to get Surface in our home, and or this type of technology in our home? So the positive side is that things like Windows 7 will have touch. It's touch enabled. It has touch APIs for it. For Surface, right now our strategy is still commercial environments, and we've obviously discussed and looked into the consumer strategy, but we still remain focused on commercial for this time. So before everyone runs out of here, please fill out these speaker evaluation forms, because it tells me, if I was any good or if I was really bad. And it's helpful to me, it's helpful to the MIX people to enable them to figure out who they need to bring in here next year. So thank you guys, thank you for your attention. I applaud you for that, especially on the last day.